Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Alta Price, a translator from Italian and German, and a member of the Translators Collective Cedilla and Company. We're delighted to be collaborating with the Center for Fiction to bring you this monthly series and are grateful for the Center's support. These translation clinics are intended as knowledge-sharing open sessions for translators and lovers of translation from all backgrounds and experience levels. Each month, we invite a different literary translator to present on or discuss a subject of their choice with a Cedilla member, followed by a Q&A with attendees. Topics may range from questions and theories of craft to submissions, contracts, and other practical concerns, always with an eye to literary translation as a profession. Attendees are encouraged to bring questions from their own practice. These sessions will be recorded and available for later viewing. Live captioning is also available. You can click on the CC button on the bottom menu for various options. We invite you to turn your camera on if you like and settle in for the conversation, during which everyone except Kareem and myself will be muted. Feel free to add comments and questions in the chat, which tonight will be moderated by Cedilla member Alex Zucker, a translator from Czech. For the second half of the session, we'll open the conversation. If you're comfortable speaking on screen, raise your hand either by clicking at the bottom of the participants list or by using the reactions button, and you'll be invited to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. Or if you prefer Alex to read your question, please send it privately to Cedilla in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them, but we apologize in advance if we run out of time. For those who are unable to attend our live events, we encourage you to email questions or comments before or after the sessions to translationclinics@centerforfiction.org. We hope to make these conversations ongoing to include viewers in as many time zones as possible. And now let's dive in. Today, we have the good fortune to hear from Kareem James Abu-Zeid, a translator of authors from across the Arab world who translates from Arabic, French, and German. His work has earned him an NEA translation grant, Penn Center USA's Translation Award, Poetry Magazine's Translation Prize, residencies from the Lannan Foundation and the Banff Center, a Fulbright Fellowship to Germany, and a CASA Fellowship in Egypt, among other honors. His most recent translation is Najwan Darwish's Exhausted on the Cross from NYRB Poets 2021, which is now on the long list for PEN America's Award for Poetry and Translation. Congrats, Kareem. He is also the author of The Poetics of Adonis and Yves Bonnefoy, Poetry as Spiritual Practice. The online hub for his work is www.kareemjamesabuzaid.com. Tonight, Kareem and I will talk about what it takes to translate the intangible, since so much of what translators work on doesn't involve meaning in the dictionary sense. We will also explore approaches to prioritizing what's most important when honing the vision for your translation. So with that, I will pass the mic to Kareem. Kareem has a brief talk, after which I have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So welcome, Kareem. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about translation.
Thanks, Alta. And Alta didn't mention it, but she's got a book on the PEN America Prose long list as well, which just came out. So fortuitous timing for this event. So I'm going to talk for probably about 10-15 minutes about this notion of translating the intangible, which has kind of been in different ways, I think the theme of the year for me a little bit. And I guess with intangible, what I was thinking when we came up with the title was sort of what gets translated other than meaning or in addition to meaning. And obviously with translation, there's a tendency to think in terms of mirroring, being faithful or unfaithful to a text. And usually when people, I think, use terms like that, something like faithful, let's say a faithful translation, they're talking about being faithful to the meaning of the original or source text. And so I wanted to just very quickly kind of go over a few of the, I'm going to call them intangibles, but the things other than meaning that get translated. Most of my examples are going to come from poetry, but most of these are equally, or they are also relevant to prose, let's put it that way. Sometimes it might be emphasized more in poetry. But I think pretty much all my remarks are also going to be relevant to prose. So I'm going to just go through a few of these things and discuss them. I'll give short examples, and if there's anything we want to delve into in more detail, we can do that in the conversation or in the questions. And so I guess the premise of my remarks here is that really the translator needs to have a clear interpretation of the text that they're translating, and they need to have a vision for it, a very clear vision. And what that means is, there's so many different aspects, so many things going on in any given text, let's say in the source language. And in English, particularly with poetry, we might not be able to convey all of those, right, necessarily. You might not be able to tick off all the boxes of everything that's happening in the source text. So then, what happens is really it's the translator's job to decide which aspects of the source text to emphasize when they're translating. And I think this becomes very salient when you have a short poem, let's say, because then you really have to make some decisions. If you've got a whole novel, you might be able to compensate for things here and there. And, you lose something in one sentence and you can put it in another sentence. You've got 200 pages to work with, let's say. But for a poem, that's usually not the case. So I'm going to give some examples. The first thing, I think, maybe with poetry especially, but also with prose, one level maybe behind the bare meaning or the sort of semantic aspect of the text, is the image. All right, so this is maybe the first intangible that we could consider. And I want to just give an example to really talk about what I mean here. And it's a 2-line poem, very short poem by an Iraqi poet, Dunya Mikhail. And a very literal translation of this small poem, which is from a book called The Iraqi Nights, would be as follows. Whenever you throw stones into the sea, I undulate. All right, now that's a very literal translation. That second line is the problem, right? The verb in Arabic is a strange verb, atamawaju, which comes from the noun mauj or mauja, which is a wave. And so atamawaju we could translate as I undulate. That was the only English equivalent I found that was one word, really. You could say I become a wave, I become wave-like, any of those kind of things, right? Unfortunately, none of those sound particularly good in English as poetry, right? But that would be a literal sort of meaning-based translation. So there is one example where I think it's useful to step back, take a look at the image. What's the image that's going on here? That first line is, whenever you throw stones into the sea, right? This is a love poem. It's part of a series of love poems. So there's probably many ways to do it, but stepping back and kind of looking at the image gave me the solution that I found for that poem in the book. And it turned into, whenever you throw stones into the sea, it sends ripples through me, right? That was how I did it, because I was really I just tried to get away from the words and all right, what's going on here? Now, you could say, all right, a lot of stuff changed, right? It went from an active verb to the speaker being passive, right? It sends ripples through me, very different, right? So I had to decide what was important with that. And for me, the image was the most important thing in that text. And so that dictated that decision, right? Now, for someone else, they may say, no, the wave is really important. You got to keep the wave in there, or those kind of things. And then the translation would change. So that's image is one example. Another example of an intangible, and there's a wide range within this category, would be something like emotional impact. And that can be really important in texts. And an example that I always like to go back to is the very beginning, just because so many people know it, the very beginning of Homer's Iliad. And if you all remember, at the very beginning, Achilles he's angry, he is raging. That's where the text starts. And so I wanted to give 2 translations here. These aren't mine, obviously, by 2 different Roberts. Robert Fitzgerald, 1974, and then I'm going to give another translation by a different Robert. Just the first couple lines. These are the opening lines of the Iliad. So Robert Fitzgerald, 1974, by no means a bad translation. This is how he translates the beginning. Anger be now your song, immortal one. Achilles' anger, doomed and ruinous, that caused the Achaeans loss on bitter loss. It's good translation. But I want to give one that I like more because I think there's a very strong vision. Again, it comes to what the translator decides to emphasize. And that's Robert Fagel's translation, which was 1990. And here's how that starts. And I think you'll immediately kind of be able to tell the difference in the feel of the two translations. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that caused the Achaeans countless losses. So again, there, that opening starts with rage and then a dash, right? So there's just immediately, it's just there centered, and then rage, goddess, sing the rage, and then he brings in murderous. So there's a translation. It's an obvious example, but I like it because I think Fagel's really had a strong vision there in terms of, he knew what he wanted to emphasize right at the beginning. And so that's translating, another intangible, something like emotional impact. There's something that's similar to it, but not quite the same, that I found comes up a lot in my translations, which I was trying to think of what to call it. Some of these things are difficult to categorize, but the word I came up with was punch, something like when you really want a poem to hit home. And it particularly impacts, for me anyway, the end of a poem. Like it's got to land really well. And I'm going to read a short poem from a Palestinian poet, Najwan Darwish. And the poem is called Who Remembers the Armenians? And that's the title. And the title is a quote. It's a quote by Hitler that he used essentially to, yes, it's from that book, not the book that just came out, but one previous. Is called Nothing More to Lose. Anyway, the quote, Who Remembers the Armenians? Hitler supposedly said this to one of his Wehrmacht commanders, and it was used to basically justify the Holocaust. And this was right before the Nazi invasion of Poland. The idea being the Turks slaughtered the Armenians, there was a genocide there, who remembers them, right? So it's a heavy poem, obviously, but this is one where I felt like you needed punch at the end. So who remembers the Armenians? I remember them, and I ride the nightmare bus with them each night. And my coffee this morning, I'm drinking it with them. You, murderer, who remembers you? So again, that is a very particularly intangible one. I think it's difficult, but it comes up a lot in poems, right? And that's a kind of heavy poem. It's not light subject matter there. And you want the end to really, like I said, hit home. Something else that I think, probably a lot of translators deal with and grapple with is obviously particularly important in poetry is musicality and sound, right? And my kind of approach to sound elements in poetry, so rhyme, rhythm, those kind of things, particularly with Arabic, because it's radically different from English, is not so much mirroring, it's more compensation. So with a lot of Arabic poetry, it's fairly easy to rhyme in Arabic. Some poets, like the Syrian-born poet Adonis, he uses rhyme a lot. It still sounds very modern in Arabic, at least the way he uses it. In English, however, I feel that rhyme, and at least strong end rhyme, feels kind of dated. And so instead of trying to just mirror and capture the rhyme and the rhythm and somehow mirror it in English or come up with equivalents, usually what I do is try to compensate. And so I compensate with sound devices like assonance, consonants. I try to find a different strong rhythm if that's applicable to the poem at hand. Also internal rhymes, things like that, maybe the occasional end rhyme, stuff like that. So I'll give one short example of that, which is a poem by Adonis. And you should just know his poetry is very ambiguous. There's kind of a mystic, timeless quality to it. This book is 200 pages of poetry that centers on one figure. So it really probably is best read as one long poem. And so I'm just reading a short poem from the middle of this collection, Songs of Mihyar the Damascene. And it's called Kina al-Ughniyat. And I'll read the Arabic first. You'll hear the rhyme in the Arabic. باسم تاريخه في بلاد الوحول يأكل حين يجوء جبينه ويموت وتجهل كيف يموت الفصول خلف هذا القناع الطويل من الأغنيات وحده البذرة الأمينة وحده ساكن في قرار الحياة. So when I'm reading the English, let's just do a little exercise here if we can. And this is one of my favorite translation exercises. This is what I do with my poetry texts anyway. I don't do this when I'm translating prose. And so when I'm reading the translation, see if you can just suspend meaning for a minute while we're listening to it and focus exclusively on sound. And so then you can listen for the assonance, the consonants, the rhythm, the rhyme. I'd really say it's almost more important than the specific meaning of this poem. So that's the idea here. Just let go of the meaning for a minute and just listen to the sounds. So this one is called The Mask of Songs. In the name of his history in a land mired in mud, he consumes his brow in hunger. He perishes without the seasons knowing how, behind this long mask of songs. He alone is the faithful seed. He alone dwells in the depth of life. So again, that's an exercise that I try to do when I'm translating poetry. And it's particularly important with someone like Adonis, where sometimes the meaning doesn't really carry a poem. Let's put it that way. You've got a sort of long 200-page poetic web, and it's more about the echoes between the different poems and things like that. And I guess the very last example I'm going to give, which comes up, this is a prose example. I've given some examples of stuff I worked well. I thought it'd be good if I gave an example of a failed translation. I worked as a translator and an editor on a book for MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it's called, and I don't have the book, it's in a box right now. It's called Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents. And so it's a big 500-page book with a lot of art. If you were going to teach an Arabic art history course, you'd use this, basically. That was the idea behind the book. And there were a whole bunch of different translators because it was a massive project and it spanned 120 years. And my job with this, in addition to translating a few of the texts from Arabic and French, was basically to be the translation editor. So I was quality control. I went sort of line by line through all the translations to make sure the meaning was good, to make sure it read well in English. It was a sort of 2-year project that I worked on. And anyway, one of the texts in this book, I can't remember the artist's name, but he was an Arab artist who lived in Japan in the 1970s. And he had something that was kind of like a 3D printer. It was a machine that printed 3-dimensional art objects. He didn't call it a 3D printer because those weren't around back then, but it was some machine that produced 3D art objects based on inputs that apparently he put into this machine. And so anyway, this book had 3 editors who were in charge of getting the texts and picking them out. And then I was the translation editor. And then with this text, there was another translator. So in theory, we had 5 people looking at this text. And it was translated. I thought the translation was fine. Everyone thought it was good. And I edited it some. And anyway, long story short, a couple months after the book was published, one of the main editors wrote to me and said, "Hey, you remember that text about the that artist living in Japan with the weird printing machine?" I said, "Yeah, of course I remember that one." She said, "Well, that machine never existed. That whole text was supposed to be sarcastic and funny, apparently. And all of us missed it. Everyone missed it, right?" And so there's an example. We totally missed the tone of the text, right? I can tell you on a dictionary level, every word was correct. But boy, we would have made a lot of different choices if we'd realized that about that specific text. Nobody knew it was supposed to be humorous, and the artist had since passed. So, and I'm not sure how that editor found out. So anyway, that's one last example, tone and voice, which comes up a lot in prose, obviously, in addition to poetry. And there's many other intangibles we could talk about. Sometimes they're just difficult to describe feelings. With different texts. German has that nice word, das Unheimliche, the uncanny, right? So how do you get an uncanny feeling into a text? How do you get, some texts have that frenetic quality, things like that, right? And then there's spiritual texts where sometimes there's a quality of transmission. I'm preparing a talk on that aspect in Sufi and Buddhist texts, and that's a whole other thing. And so anyway, we can go into more detail on any of these or branch off, but I think that's the gist of what I wanted to share.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kareem. And I'm sure everyone is formulating their questions to put in the chat. I feel as though you answered a ton of the questions that I initially wanted to ask you, which is great. And I appreciate those examples. To go back to that first example that you mentioned, the Dunya Mikhail poem with the I undulate. So you mentioned with that one, you mentioned image, but specifically I want to ask you about rhyme, because you mentioned how clearly Arabic is so radically different from English. And I feel as though you didn't read us the Arabic original for that one, but I was wondering, did you introduce that rhyme by having C rhyme with sends ripples through me? Or did the rhyme help you arrive at your solution? Or was it chance?
Honestly, that one was accidental. And I don't like strong end rhyme in English. And sometimes I've changed my translations, even if the original poem rhymes, which that one doesn't in Arabic. I've changed them to avoid rhyme in English because I think it sounds a bit dated. But that one I left in because, so I'm trying to remember it now. Whenever you throw stones into the sea, it sends ripples through me. That second me to me is not very strong. So I felt like it was okay to keep that in there. It wasn't like super strong end rhyme for me, but it was by chance. And I thought for a little bit about, is there a way to avoid this? Just because I usually don't like having super strong end rhyme. But yeah, that one wasn't intentional.
That's great. That actually ties directly into another question I had, because I noticed when you're reading, you put the emphasis on through me. It sends ripples through me. So I'm wondering, that's another sort of the stress. And I think this is important in poetry, but also happens in prose. And it's, I think, frequently between languages, completely impossible to maintain. How do you, how much do you happen to use, or do you recommend people use things like italics or underlining? Or, I feel like this is an issue that comes up with editors, and you mentioned that you have also edited others' translations. How to handle the very fact that translators for prose and poetry we are silent when our work is published. It's text on page. How do you bridge that gap of the difference between a recited or oral AURAL text and experience versus textual, static on the page?
That's a hard one. I mean, I guess obviously I think a lot of translators do this. It's important to read the translations out loud, just as a craft practice, whether it's poetry or prose, to see where you might be stumbling on something. There's italics too. Obviously, I don't use too many of those, but they are a nice device to use, I think, when needed. And there's certain things in Arabic. Arabic doesn't really use italics. They'll use bold or underline, instead in Arabic text. But there's certain things in Arabic where you can provide emphasis. And so sometimes in English, something like that would require italics. Like in Arabic, you rarely ever write if the subject of a verb is a pronoun, like I walk, for example, you wouldn't put the I. The I is included in the verb, if that makes any sense, right? And if you wrote the pronoun out in Arabic, it would really be like saying, I am walking, right? Not you. So there are times like that when I'll use italics, but it's tricky. I just try to read it out loud. Sometimes I'll have friends or colleagues take a look and read it out loud to see how they read it. But I don't know if there's a good solution for that, really.
Yeah. You mentioned the spiritual text and this quality of transmission, and I would love to hear you say a little bit more about this quality of transmission.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a difficult one to answer. How to approach that? So I've been looking at one text in particular. I'm giving a talk on this in Madison, Wisconsin in the spring. And I wanted to talk about kind of my favorite translation of a Buddhist text, or at least it's my favorite one right now. And the text is it's the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 8,000 lines, which is often translated as the perfection of wisdom in 8,000 lines. And it's kind of the main Mahayana Buddhist text. And there is a scholarly translation of it, which is very good. And there's another guy, Lex Hickson, who did I don't even know that he reads the original, but he based it on the other translation, and he called it Mother of the Buddhas, Meditation on the Prajnaparamita Sutra. And he doesn't call it a translation. He calls it, I think, a contemplative expansion. But essentially, it's a translation. It's a translation based on this more scholarly work. And so we could do a quick, let's just do a quick, it's difficult to talk about spiritual stuff because it gets very airy-fairy, and it's difficult to sort of pin down the concepts. I mean, I wrote my whole dissertation on this kind of thing, but if we can do another very quick exercise, which would be just to sit for a second and maybe take a deep breath or two. This is a meditation exercise, not a translation exercise, but I promise I'll bring it back to translation. And so just take a deep breath or two. And then you can have your eyes open or closed. Just have a thought. It can be any thought. We could do all dragons are green, for example, or any thought. Thoughts will continue arising. Now, there is an awareness of the thought. Yes, hopefully everyone agrees on that point. And that awareness, that quality of being aware, is not a thought. It is what observes the thought. Let's put it that way. And so that's kind of that awareness, that aware quality, which can observe thought, emotion, body sensation, in fact, all perception, which is kind of radical. Anything you perceive, you are aware. It appears in this field of awareness, we could call it. That field of awareness, which we could spend a long time talking about, even though it's very simple because there's no thought attached to it. It's just aware of whatever is arising. That's the entry point for all, we could say that is the entry point for all spiritual experience, at least from a Buddhist point of view, we could say that, and really from most traditions' points of views. And part of what, for example, this Buddhist sutra that I'm speaking of, part of what it's trying to do is to invoke, we could call it the awareness of awareness. So rather than just being focused on thoughts or sensations or emotions, it's trying to evoke the experience of that awareness, which is prior to thought, or within which thought and everything else arises. All right, so it's trying to evoke a very specific experience. And that is kind of the transmission quality. And I think the argument can be made, and it's, I'm giving the example just from one text, but this is true of almost, any major Buddhist text from any tradition. It doesn't have to be from the Buddha necessarily, Tibetan texts, anything, right? Any of the Zen texts in particular are well known for their transmission quality. So it's trying to transmit a certain experience that can open doors in terms of meditation. And my sort of experience as a reader and a meditation practitioner is that there is a radically different quality to the translations that come out from translators or scholars who are not interested in the practicing aspects, the actual experiential aspect of these texts. They're coming at it as scholars or historians, which is fine. But the experience of reading those texts is radically different than the experience of reading a text from someone who is a practitioner, who has spent, hours and months and years on the meditation mat, and who has experience of personal experience of what these texts are pointing to. And so that's, I'm exploring that aspect a lot right now. And there's a lot of poets who come at this too. And, a very classic, probably the most famous example we could come up with in modern times would be Coleman Barks' translations of Rumi, right? Presumably Rumi was coming from writing his poetry from a certain, let's call it state of being, right? And it's a very mystic, there's obviously a strong mystic quality to a lot of it. Now, Coleman Barks is, he took translated trots, as far as I know, he doesn't read Persian or Farsi, and created something new with that. And a lot of scholars don't like them. A lot of poets also don't like those translations because he gets rid of all the Islamic references. He turns it into something universal. But if we hold to the premise that maybe the main point of those texts is to convey a certain experience of being, then I would say Coleman Barks does a very good job of that, even though he's quite possibly losing a lot of the specifics, a lot of the cultural minutiae, stuff like that. And so anyway, that's something I've been exploring a lot. And I have noticed there's just a big difference, particularly with Buddhist texts and stuff, when I can always tell when it's kind of a dry scholarly translation, but the terms are right, as opposed to somebody who's really looking at it as, here's a living, vivid text, right? And this is one where it's so intangible, it's very hard to, that experience of awareness is pre-conceptual. So the act of pointing toward it with language is in a certain sense doomed to failure. You've just got to kind of do the best you can. But there are some translations, and this one book called Mother of the Buddhas by this guy Lex Hickson is one of them where, when I first discovered it, I was just kind of blown away because I never heard of him before, and it wasn't the main translation of that sutra that everyone knows. So anyway, that's maybe a long answer to that question.
Oh, very helpful answer. Thank you so much. I guess I have one final question for me before we open it up to the audience Q&A, and then we'll wrap up the audience Q&A with the final question that we ask all of our co-hosts in this series. But I'm wondering if you've given us a lot of material, a lot of issues to think about. I wonder if you have any tips for translators who are still developing a clear vision of their project's key elements and how to prioritize them. So, I mean, it's one thing to say, have a clear vision and prioritize what you're doing. But I just wonder, I think that especially for translators who are just dipping their toes in the translation waters or, have found a text that they absolutely love and ascertained that rights are available and they're not sure how to approach it. Do you have any tips? Is this something, I'm presuming you potentially grappled with this in your own work? Any tips for others?
In terms of the craft of the translation?
The craft, well, developing the vision, but then also prioritizing, right? So, yeah, I don't want to over-explain, but.
Yeah, we gotcha. Well, I guess I suppose the one practical tip I would have would be to try to do some kind of translation workshop or residency or something like that, because for me at least, when I had 2 workshops in college, but I didn't really. It was when I went to do a residency in Banff, which was after I'd translated a couple books, that I felt like I really upped my game a little bit as a translator and got my confidence as a translator. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a long residency. It can be a workshop or something with a more experienced translator. That really helped me a lot, and it helped me start to be able to have the confidence, because sometimes it's a bit of a confidence thing, I think. And I was coming from a very academic background. There was a lot of emphasis on meaning. At that point, I thought I wanted to be in academia, and I was worried about my translations being judged, as having lost key aspects of the text or something like that. And then going and doing that residency and just, learning from all these more experienced translators, really, it kind of helped free me of some of those shackles, I guess. And then the rest was more, I guess, trial and error. I mean, it's like anything else. You got to put in the hours. And while we're on it, there's a great book that I like it's kind of perfect for this kind of topic, is the Elliot Weinberger, 19, I think it's called 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei.
13.
So it's how many?
13.
13 is a 13. Okay, it's anyway. It might be the revised edition that is 19.
Oh, he expanded it.
I think he expanded, yeah, because now it says with new ways is on the cover. But yeah, it's all these different translations of the same poem from from the Tang Dynasty era, and it's great because there's just it's different visions for the same poem. I think that's a great thing to look at as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we'll move into the audience Q&A now. As we do this, we invite you to turn your camera on if you like. To repeat, if you're comfortable speaking on screen, raise your hand either by clicking at the bottom of the participants list or by using the reactions button, and you'll be invited to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. If you prefer, Alex can read your question for you. Just send it privately to Cedilla in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them, but we apologize in advance if we run out of time. So do we have any questions?
We do. We have 2 questions already. So the first question comes from TL, who says, thank you so much.
Tess Lewis.
Oh, it's Tess.
Hi, Tess.
I wasn't even, okay. Hey, Tess. Thank you so much, Kareem, especially for examples that weren't entirely successful. How do you navigate feelings of self-doubt? That nagging question, who am I to translate the gifted and experienced author X? And then on top of that question, a comment, I really appreciate your distinction between an experiential versus a scholarly reading or translation of a poem. Instinct might be another word for the experiential approach to translation. So.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I like that point about instinct. But it's like, it's like with anything else, I think it takes it takes practice to start to develop those instincts, right? One of my meditation teachers always uses the example, he talks about that same thing in meditation. He talks about jazz musicians and how, you hear them improvising and it's just amazing, right? But if they haven't practiced for years and years and years and they just start improvising, it sounds horrible and self-indulgent and whatever. So I like that point about the instinct, but it's also, it's instinct that comes through the many years of experience, I guess. For that first part, the self-doubt, it's a good question. I mean, again, I felt for me going to do a residency was really important. I had not gone through an MFA program. I hadn't really ever formally studied translation. And so I think just seeing how other translators were doing it was really helpful. I don't know if I have a good answer to the self-doubt question though, because it's so personal and so emotional, but probably also just experience and practice. And, the fact of the matter is, there's always going to be someone criticizing the work, especially if you're translating a big, a major author, as Tess has translated a lot of them, right? Then everyone's going to come at it with an opinion, right? And that this is what's important or that's what's important, and you can't please all the people all the time. And I think that's just for me anyway, that's part of it. If sometimes there are I'll get a negative review or something about, or some aspect of a translation will be criticized, and it's just like, okay, well, you know what, I made that choice and not everyone's going to like it.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Susan Lippman, who asks, how necessary is it to speak more than one language to enhance your understanding of your primary language? Quite literally, how important is it to be bilingual so that one is more open to expressing a thought multiple ways? And Susan then elaborated, I understand this talk is about translation, which obviously implies more than one language. I'm asking this question in a general way about the need and benefit of being familiar in more than one language.
Oh, well, that's a huge question, Susan. Thank you for it. I'm gonna try to just give a more specific answer, I guess, to that. I mean, I think it's super beneficial. I don't know if important is the right word. I certainly, I grew up overseas with multiple languages, multiple cultures. I really, later on, I appreciated how much that informed me as a person. And I do think there's, when I was in college, I was really into German philosophy, and that was why I read German. I wanted to read Nietzsche in German. I wanted to read Kant in German. I wanted to read Hegel in German. Now I can, I don't like most of those authors, but there was a very interesting, you start reading things like that in that language, and it's like, oh, these people had to write in this language. There was no way that Hegel was going to come out of a different European language. It just wasn't, it's so embedded in the way the thought was. And I think that's probably true of a lot of different languages. And but I guess I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I mean, it's certainly benefited me, and I've been really grateful for the experiences I've had in multiple languages, but I'm also not a true bilingual. English is my mother tongue, and the other languages are very much second languages. And my skill set is stronger, with my strongest spoken one is German, but my strongest reading one is Arabic, and probably I can write the best in French. So I'm not bilingual in the way that many translators are, where they're just completely effortlessly moving through, reading, writing, speech, listening. Everything is the same in both. I'm gonna leave it there, Alex. Sorry. It's a huge question, but I appreciate it, and I encourage everyone to learn more languages. I guess is where I'll leave that.
It is a huge question. Anyone other? I'll go back to my questions, but I want to give a chance to the audience members to ask. But actually, since no one's raising their hand yet, I will piggyback on that question actually. So you mentioned, Hegel and Heidegger. That idea that meaning, oftentimes I feel like meaning comes from sound, right? And we have this notion that you can separate meaning from sound until you realize you really can't. And I feel like this is something that writers maybe talk about more than translators. And I'm just curious your viewpoint on it. This idea that if, say, I'm translating a text where I choose to emphasize the alliteration, or maybe there isn't an alliteration in the original, but my way of sort of capturing the tone of the original is to rely on alliteration in the language I'm translating into. I don't know how, what's my question here? How much do you feel like meaning and sound are completely connected? Or guide your decision as a translator or your practice? Has that evolved over your translation career so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think more and more I pay more attention to sound, and that may be why. I mean, the first, I think, 3 or 4 books I translated were novels, and since then I've done nothing but poetry. And next year I have another. I mean, in terms of the literary projects, and so I think I gravitate more and more towards sound. And there are, there's, like, if I want to really inspire, I mean, it depends on what project I'm working on, but there's different translations I'll go to if I really want to kind of get my translation juices going, and so, like, I really love Emily Wilson's, new translation of Homer is amazing. But then, like, another one I'll go to, one of my favorites just for sound is listening to Seamus Heaney read his translation of Beowulf, and it's on YouTube, and I'll just listen to that. And sometimes I'll do that exercise we were doing with that one poem, where I just drop the meaning and just listen to the sound, and it's so beautiful with the Irish lilt and all that. So I guess it's become more and more important to me, but I don't know if I have an answer about sound and meaning. I'm not sure I have a good one for that. I see Sean has a question though.
Yeah, I wanted to ask. I'm fascinated that you translate from 3 different languages that are from 3 different language groups, and I wanted to ask, how different is your process when translating from these 3 different languages, and how different is your thinking when translating from these 3 different languages?
Yeah, that's a good question. All of my literary projects up until now, the literary ones, have been novels or poetry, we'll call it that. have been from Arabic. And so I felt at this point, having done it now for, over a decade, I've got the processes down. I know the tricks. I know, you know what I mean? Even when I'm editing, if I'm editing someone else's translation, if they're not very experienced, I know exactly what the Arabic is based on the English because of how they've created the construction. Next year, I have my first book from a French, her name's Olivia Elias. She's a French language poet of the Palestinian diaspora. In other words, she was born in Palestine in 44, born in Haifa, exiled in 48 to Beirut, went to French high schools, lost her Arabic, then wound up in Quebec, and now is in France. And it's been interesting because I found, and it's coming out in May, but I haven't got the edits back from the press yet. But I have submitted to some journals and gotten edits back from the editors there. And what's been interesting with that, this being the first real poetry I translated from French, is I've been missing stuff that not catching things in the translations that I think I would have caught had I been translating from Arabic. So it's been a bit of an eye-opening experience. And maybe part of it is also with Arabic, you kind of have to go free from the word order and all this stuff. They're so different. Whereas French, I mean, even if you use something like Google Translate, if you Google Translate a French text, like a prose text, it'll come out pretty readable in English. If you do it with Arabic, often it doesn't. And I've noticed, I think some of the mistakes I'm making are because the languages are so similar and I'm kind of taking certain things for granted and I'm not really stepping back quite enough. So it has been a very interesting process with that, and sort of an eye-opening one. And I'm looking forward to, getting the edits back from the actual press to see what else I kind of missed or what other things I stumbled on without realizing it. They were just things I didn't notice. So hopefully that starts to answer that question.
That's great, thank you. So we have another question in the chat, but last call for anyone who wanted to raise their hand, because we do need to be mindful of the time. We've got about 10 minutes left. And without any other hands raised, Alex, did you have a final question from an audience member?
Yes, we have another question from Susan, who I think, well, I'm not going to comment on it. I'm just going to read the question. Given the responsibility and freedom the translator has, should they be given equal credit on the front page?
Well, I don't know what equal credit, if equal credit means the same as the author, I mean, I'm happy getting credit on the on the front page. I don't know if it needs to be equal, right? Because the original work, you're still working with someone else's text. That's the starting point, right? Even if it becomes your own text. I've never thought about asking for equal credit. So should they be given equal credit? I'm just happy when my name appears on the cover. But I guess for me, maybe especially at this point in my career, I don't care as much about it as I used to. And I've always had presses that put the translators' names on the cover, so I'm happy about that. There was one exception, which was the Adonis, which is this book. I don't know if you can see it there. They took this is the New Directions version. The UK version looks different. It was published by Penguin in the UK. But you see this patterning here is from a Syrian door. Adonis is from Syria. This book is primarily set in Damascus. There were two translators. This was a co-translation. I should have actually said that. I translated it with Ivan Eubanks. And the cover was just so sleek and elegant like this, with the door and then Adonis's name, his pen name just being one word. I didn't ask to get our names on the cover because I actually thought the book looked better like this. So there was one case where it didn't bother me at all because I just liked the way the book looked. I guess also with me, everyone's got kind of a different philosophy of translation. And, I fall into the category of the translation should sound like it was written by a native English speaking author, and that it shouldn't call a whole bunch of attention to itself, all right? Unless there's a a particular reason to do so in the text. So I do not like my translations to call attention to themselves. All right. I don't put a lot of Arabic in there. I don't keep Arabic words. It's very rare that I'll do something like that. And I do it sometimes. Actually, the new Najwan Darwish book, there was a poem that was about an activist, and he used the word fada'i in Arabic. And it turns out in English, it's a word, fada'i. We have fadayin, which was usually used to denote, guerrilla fighters in the intifadas in Palestine. But that was one of the few examples I kept in Arabic in there. The line I think was, Christ was a fada'i just like you. And I kept that in there because I felt like the meaning of the word in Arabic is one who sacrifices themselves, right? Presumably it's a sacrifice, and it's often used in the sense of a lamb or some creature being slaughtered. Whereas in English, fadayin has become associated almost with terrorism since 9/11. So that was one moment where I kept it in. But generally speaking, I like the translator to be in. I'm happy when people read something I've translated and don't realize it was translated. It doesn't bother me at all, because to me, that means I've done a good job. So I suppose for me also, it's not as important to get equal credit in that sense. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but I'm not trying to call attention to myself as a translator. I'm not trying to get my translations to call attention to themselves. I like them to be fluid. There was a review of the Najwan Darwish book where they didn't even mention that it was translated. And I was, of course, it's nice to get the credit and people say, oh, this is a great translation. But I liked that review because I was like, wow, okay, this person just read it as poetry in English. I've done my job. They forgot that it was translated. So in that sense, I was happy also. So I have kind of an not idiosyncratic, but not all translators fall into that category of it needs to be supernatural in English, assuming it sounds natural in Arabic. There's other translators who are more about, let's kind of push the bounds of English by bringing in more stuff from the foreign languages. And it's just not the approach I take. I have nothing against that approach. It's just not mine. So it's a good question, though.
All right. It is a hot button question right now. And I feel as though the names and the people on my screen are having feelings about this, which is good.
They call it domestication. This is what I hate. I got accused by an editor of domesticating a text because I changed centimeters to inches once in a poem. And it really bothered me. I was like, domesticate, it sounds so awful. Like I'm part of the domestication camp. But anyway, that's my little rant there.
Well, perhaps this ties into our final question. What would an ideal future of literary translation look like to you?
An ideal future of literary, this is the question you ask everyone? Okay, I wasn't prepared for that. What would an ideal future of literary translation look like to me? I think, I think it's moving in the right direction. I do feel like translators are getting a lot more credit, which ties back to our other thing, the last question. Oh yes, Kay just wrote it. Hi Kay. Enough money to support translations. That would be ideal. Yes. It would be nice to get paid slightly better rates for literary translations. I generally feel like I lump my work into two categories, the literary and then what pays the bills. So on a practical level, that would be nice to not have such a separation of those things. But I guess I feel like things are moving in a good direction. A lot of MFA programs are including translation now, and English, even like English programs in universities and stuff. I'm a pure freelancer. I'm not, I've done guest teaching gigs, but I'm not faculty anywhere, so I might not be quite as in tune with what's going on at all the universities. But it does seem like literary translation is in a good place right now. So maybe I would just want it to keep moving in that direction, I guess. And I do think it would be great to have our names on the covers. Would be wonderful. Other than that, I'm not really sure. I think that would be it. I think we're moving in the right direction. Keep going that way.
Excellent. Keep going. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Kareem, so much. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you again to the Center for Fiction for hosting these clinics. And again, thank you, Kareem. I took copious notes as you spoke, and I'm really grateful, as are all of us at Cedilla, that you came on this evening. Translation clinics have been taking place on the third Thursday of every month. A link to the Literary Translation Clinics event page is in the chat. So I invite you all to bookmark that and stay tuned for the center's upcoming translation events. We look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future. Please stay safe. And as Kareem said, keep going, keep reading, and keep translating. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.